the World Trade Center, Denver. I'd like to thank you again for welcoming us, attending our event today, and welcome. The World Trade Center, Denver, here we have trade services that we provide to our local trade community in the Rocky Mountain region. We have events and classes, and we'd love you to take a look at our calendar for what's coming up in the near future. We will have a question and answer at the end of the event today. So the last 15 minutes we'll be taking your questions and our panelists will be answering those questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We do have a global audience today at our event. We have 9 countries represented and many states. So thank you again to our audience. We appreciate you engaging with us today. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. And thank you very much to our moderator, Pam Reichert. Appreciate you, and I'll pass the mic over to you now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Catherine. And again, thank you to the World Trade Center for hosting this event today. I can't tell you how important it is for all of us to be thinking through these issues as we wrap up the presidential elections and head into a new administration. The World Trade Center does so much, not just education and advocating for everyone, importing and exporting large, medium, and small businesses. So thanks again to you guys for everything you do. So first, I'm going to introduce myself, and then we'll move on to our panelists. As Catherine said, I'm Pam Reichert. I've been in Denver for about 20 years. My background is in foreign policy and international finance, and I landed in Denver about 20 years ago to work in the International Trade Division over at CoBank. I was the country risk officer for many years, and then I moved into portfolio management. I moved to Denver after my stints on the East Coast because I'm really a Midwestern girl. And so Denver was a great fit for me, and I love all the outdoor activities. And I finally learned to ski as an adult. Anyway, as I got more engaged in the community, I realized that my work at CoBank was really outside of the country in many respects. And so I ended up moving. I had an opportunity to be the International Trade Director under former Governor Bill Ritter. And so I did that for 4 years before kind of going even deeper into local economic development as the Vice President of the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation. I really enjoyed my time there, learning more about regional development and bringing my international experience to a more local audience. So that's enough about me. I would love to move on to our panelists. We decided that they would introduce themselves in alphabetical order. We're starting at the latter end of the alphabet. We're going to start with Tyler Raut, and then Tyler is with PAX8. And then we're going to move to Karen Tramontano with Blue Sky Strategies out of Washington, D.C. Then we have Mark Truax, who is with PacWest, and Patrick Wilson with Mediatek. So Tyler, why don't you start us off?
Excellent. Thanks so much, Pam. Well, with a last name like mine, this is probably the first time I have ever been the first to introduce myself in a panel like this, going alphabetically. But I'm definitely the least interesting of the panelists that you have in front of you today. I'm just a farm boy from Nebraska who learned about international trade, sitting around the kitchen table talking about where we were going to sell our soybeans, and then took that to law school in DC, chased some bad guys around the Middle East and Asia for about 10 years, and then moved to Colorado and have been doing international business and trade law ever since. I sit on the board of directors for the World Trade Center Denver. And if my connection fades during the day, it's because I have 5 kids here all sucking up my Wi-Fi, doing their schoolwork from home too. So if that happens, you'll know why. But that's me. So Karen, I think you're up next.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. So I'm Karen Tramontano, and I'm the CEO of Blue Star Strategy. Blue Star is a global advisory firm, and what that means is we represent U.S. companies in Europe and Latin America primarily, and we also represent foreign companies from Europe and Latin America in the U.S. market. Largely, our clients are companies that are regulated by governments, which is how we get engaged, because we put together government and public affairs strategies. Our clients are also involved in the exports and imports and are quite sensitive to various trade regimes. Before I became CEO and founder of Blue Star Strategies, along with my co-founder, Sally Painter, I served in the Clinton White House. I was Deputy Chief of Staff. And as a Deputy Chief of Staff, I was pretty much focused on the economic portfolio, which included trade, as well as several of the economic agencies, Treasury, Labor, Energy, and so on. And since I'm north of 60, I won't go further back than that because it'll take a long time, but I'm very happy to be here and look forward to the panel and the Q&A. And I'll turn it over to Mark.
Karen, thank you. Afternoon, everyone, and appreciate everyone taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I'm Mark Truex, Executive Vice President for PacWest Communications. I've managed our Denver office now a little over 7 years. Been with the firm a little over a decade cumulatively. My background is in policy, regulatory affairs, and campaigns. So a little different background, and I'll provide a little bit of a different twist to my fellow panelists today on trade. I handle a lot of energy, agriculture, and natural resources work, oil and gas, work here in Colorado in the Rocky Mountain West. Before moving back to Denver and opening the office here for PacWest, spent 3 years in DC, a short time with PacWest there, and then also with the National Trade Association, where I managed the Western United States. I was a lead interior lobbyist for a national trade group there, all of which tying in with trade, but really focusing on the policy and the regulation side. So appreciate everyone being here. And last but not least, we'll turn it over to Patrick.
Hi, thanks very much, Mark. It's kind of you to hand off to me, and thanks to Pam and the World Trade Council of Denver. It's actually great to be back with this group because I, at 16 years old, made my first trip to Colorado from Kansas City, where I grew up, and fell in love with Colorado and ended up going to both undergrad and law school at the University of Denver, and still have a long, despite my now 20 years in DC, have a long love affair with Denver and with Colorado. And despite my Twitter handle being still DU hockey fan, that's the extent. I finally paid off my student loans, so now I'm only an enthusiast for DU hockey, which keeps me connected to the University of Denver, but not to trade policy, where I've been really engaged for a long time. Today, I was introduced. I work for a company called Mediatek. Many of you may not have heard of Mediatek, but we're all around you. Many of the devices in the office, or if you're working from home today, you probably have dozens of Mediatek powered devices all around you. If you have an Alexa, or if you have a Comcast voice activated remote, we're in all of those products, a Peloton, for instance. One of the most ubiquitous technologies we have is if you're using a screen, not a laptop screen, but any TV screen to watch our broadcast today, there's about an 85% chance that that connectivity chip that's in your television is made by Mediatek, which is really the origin of our name. We're a Taiwanese headquartered company, but we've been growing our presence in the US, and we have employees in 7 states in addition to 13 other countries around the world. So it's been a real pleasure. I think part of the reason I was invited on this panel, though, today is because of my old job, because I've spent, as I said, the last 20 years in DC. Most recently, I worked for the Secretary of Commerce doing trade policy as the full-time advocate for American business on all matters that came before the Department of Commerce. But obviously, in the last 4 years, trade has been the top of the agenda for all businesses, big and small, throughout the United States. And it was my great pleasure to be the conduit, right, when businesses had issues or concerns, to take those to the Secretary, and many times to get results for businesses, and that was really fun. So I know that that's what I'm expected to contribute today, more about my experience from being a senior official in the Trump administration, working on trade, and what I see as far as the agenda in a second Trump administration, which will look a bit like the first. But that's just a little taste of what I'll say in my comments, and hopefully be able to address in your questions. So with that, I'm alphabetically the last person on the list. So I think we turn it back over to you, Pam.
Okay, great. Thank you, Patrick. So yes, we have a couple of general questions, and then I know China will be top of mind. We are going to drill down specifically into China in probably about our third question. So I'm going to start off with the first question, and Patrick, actually, after I finish the question, I'm going to turn it back over to you because I think you're a good person to start with the first question. So in this election, the impact of global trade on the US economy and workers is top of mind. President Trump's first term included a focus on bilateral versus multilateral agreements, using import tariffs with the intent to reduce the US trade deficit and support US jobs, and work unilaterally to address trade concerns, in some cases rather than working through the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So what does the second term look like with President Trump, and what is the impact on US industries and businesses? Patrick, I'm going to turn it back to you to start us off.
Well, thanks, Pam. And, you know, we had a little cheat sheet about what the questions were likely to be, and I'm not surprised by this one at all. So I did a little homework, and I checked in just with my network, again, both at USTR, at the International Trade Administration, at the Department of Commerce, and some friends on the Hill, and asked them almost that question, right? Is I know that until August, I was engaged directly at the Secretary's office in helping to set the trade agenda. But I'll tell you what the unanimous argument was, and this is not like from a campaign website or anything, is that it's going to be the focus on many of the top level priorities that have been the work of the first administration. So let's just recount quickly, right? During one term, the president successfully renegotiated trade agreements with our top trading partners, beginning with the US-Mexico Canada agreement, which was a historic once in 3 generations or in 30 years rewrite of our most critical trade relationships with Mexico and Canada. And Colorado certainly counts both Canada and Mexico as its top trading partners, but also with Japan and Korea. And those are really huge successes. We had trade agreements with Brazil in the works, and also with the UK and EU, which would round out the top 5. The kind of most important unfinished work, I would say, for the Trump administration is to continue to try and work on the bilateral relationship with China, which in my 20 years plus in DC is certainly at its lowest point now. China made a terrible gamble on a very aggressive go-it-alone strategy over both COVID and also the trade issues that US cared most about. And they have now found themselves with the Hong Kong intervention and other things very isolated. And so after the election rhetoric has died down, you know for sure that the administration is going to resume very aggressive talks. And if you doubt me on that, you notice how silent our chief trade negotiator, Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, has been, despite all of the electioneering, right, around trade policy. He wants to keep his powder dry and focus on real victories for US consumers, US workers on deals like with China. So I'll just wrap up by saying, here's a short list of what is likely to come. Much of it will begin immediately, right after the election, as soon as the president's attention can return to governing. I would say the top priority is the US-UK free trade agreement. Remember, in July of this year, the USTR announced that we would proceed with the negotiation of a free trade agreement with Kenya, which is really important and high on the agenda, as well as there's already a mini deal with Brazil that's in the works. It could have been announced yet this week. I think they just had a snag, and I think it's going to continue with the Bolsonaro administration. So those 3 things are certainly going to remain as well as obviously the UK and China. So how is that for like a laundry list of what will be the to-do items left when everybody returns from this historic week for elections?
Okay, that's a great start. Patrick, thank you for succinctly putting all that together for us. Karen, I would like to turn to you now on that question of what you see as Trump administration's priorities and its impact on US businesses.
So I think, as Patrick had said, there's, the UK, US potential for a trade agreement. It looks like the UK is going to be facing a hard Brexit, and so they're probably going to be more inclined to want to negotiate a deal with the U.S. I think there are some problems there that both the UK and the US will face, and those have to do with healthcare and whether the UK market will be closed to our healthcare industries. So far, Boris Johnson has said that's off the table. Other problems with regard to food, because the UK has very strong stakeholders who are really against U.S. Food imports. And then you have the higher labor and environmental standards of the UK, and whether there's going to be a push for the US to level up. So I think there are some problems that the US under a Trump administration will confront. I don't think it's going to be an easy deal, and we may see maybe some dropping down to a more mini trade deal that happened with Japan, where the UK deal becomes more of a regulatory standards agreement than an actual trade agreement. I think there's a similar challenge with Europe. As everybody knows, right now we have dueling retaliation as a result of the Boeing Airbus dispute. The US has already begun its retaliation authorized by the WTO of $7.5 billion. The EU now has another $4.2 billion in authorized retaliation. Now, this could be a window for the opening of a comprehensive agreement, or it could be a very escalated trade war, or it could be an opportunity just to resolve this dispute. But I think probably high on the agenda will be to get a handle on what's going on with the EU. There has been some chatter about Vietnam or pulling countries out of TPP. I mean, this administration is very clear it doesn't work on multilateral agreements and prefers bilateral agreements. But I think with the renegotiation of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, I think we're going to see a heavier hand as they had in that agreement, and that would be of Congress. I think Congress is going to play an oversized role in these bilateral agreements. And so I think we could look to see that happen in a Trump administration.
Okay, Karen, thank you very much for those comments. Mark, I'm going to turn to you next. Can you provide your insights into what you see a second administration looking like?
Sure, thanks, Pam. I really see, like has stated, a lot of the same. The president would continue to move forward if he is back victorious tomorrow or whenever the election then is called and sworn in January, really continuing the same approaches. There's a lot of things out there that would benefit that they are continuing to make incremental steps on. Karen talked about USMCA. That has had tremendous benefits and will continue to have tremendous benefit on domestic agriculture production and exports related to ag. Huge benefit right here in Colorado. And taking that and looking at it elsewhere, what it looks like with the UK, with the EU, on how we're able to get and meet international chicken demand, international beef demand, with providing a much better product that we're able to produce here in the United States and at a lower cost than what they're seeing internationally. So really looking through some of those that will impact not only Colorado, but our states around us. I also think, with the impact that we've seen with COVID and the international demand on oil and gas will also, play into this, and the president, whether it's Trump or Biden, have to take that into consideration. The United States has really moved forward, and President Trump has made it important on reducing regulatory burdens and making drilling and exploration easier for the oil and natural gas industry across the United States. Big industry here in Colorado, it, depending on the year, is #1 behind ag here in the state. But taking that and how does that impact internationally with Jordan Cove, with Keystone Pipeline, with the international markets, things of that nature, really trying to drive that and see how we're able to get responsibly produced U.S. oil and natural gas into the hands of the international markets. There is a demand for it, and there will continue to be, but also ensure that it is done so responsibly. We've got the best environmental regulations here in the U.S., anywhere in the world, on that development. So how that ties in with countries that are also looking at those, needing to have those rules and regulations in place as well, also gives us an upper hand with those trade policies. So I think a lot of it will be continuing and building and working through what that looks like and how we're able to provide those products. We have an unbelievable amount of things here, and being able to work through it like Patrick and Karen had mentioned.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Tyler, I'm going to pass it over to you. From your perspective, what do you see?
Sure. Well, there's no need for me to pile on here. I think we all sort of agree more of the same. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to you, but I think everybody's pretty clear that we're looking at more of the same. One of the challenges that I see for the Trump administration moving forward over the next 4 years is that they are limited by their approach to trade agreements that are, their preference for bilateral trade agreements rather than multilateral. Some see that as a benefit, and I understand that if you're dealing in the realm of, if you're just looking at bargaining position and trying to extract the best deal that you can from one adversary or one negotiating partner. The thing that concerns me about that is that the world we live in now is much more of a multilateral world. And, I'm a bit of a different cat than most of the folks here. My company is involved in digital trade, right? So I'm the head lawyer over at Pax8. We're a cloud distribution company. Everything that we do is born global. There's no real reason that we can't be everywhere all at the same time. The only hindrances that we tend to get are business case and politics. Those are the things that stop us, not the quality of the products, not the actual work that's being done. And bilateral agreements don't do a lick of good in the digital trade environment. They can do some work around the edges with data localization efforts and those sorts of things, but it doesn't really get to the heart of the issue on a sort of a new economy moving forward. So, I mean, frankly, that's the challenge that I see for this administration. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to move the digital economy forward, given the negotiating positions that they've taken in the past. And so that's my input.
Okay. Yes, Patrick, do you want to respond?
No, I was just going to, my initial comments were mostly intended to tee up like just a set of issues that are likely to come, but I will comment more on what Tyler and Mark and Karen made, which is sort of handicapping what may happen with that list, right? And the one point I wanted to respond to about what Mark said is that for instance, the implementation of USMCA is going to focus intently on environment and labor victories, right? Those are incredible new tools that were made a part of the USMCA that we're going to see what the real power of those are. They're unprecedented. And to Tyler's point, I thought I would at least riff and say, if you, as I am actually a big champion of multilateral trade agreements for all the points that you said, look at the victories we had on digital trade in the only multilateral trade agreement that this administration has accomplished to date, right, which is the USMCA with our two biggest trading partners. We were able to get really historic wins, and you'll forgive me for tooting our own horn, but there was a lot of bad news in the replacing the NAFTA thing. So for us to focus on the real victories we made for companies just like yours, right, to have that harmonization between Canada and Mexico on digital trade. And something you may not have thought about is that everyone, not just Republicans or people in the administration, everybody looks to the USMCA and particularly the digital chapter as the standard now, right? So we're hoping on things like intellectual property protection and other things that no matter who the next president is, they're going to look to the chapters that we successfully negotiated under USMCA and have that as a starting point, right? People may want to dial it back or dial it up depending on where we are, but that's not to be underestimated, I think. Obviously I'm in a digital business as well, and that here versus there dynamic means that common rules of the road are really important. And I'm about to say, Pam, here's the payoff, the most controversial thing that I will say on this panel today, which represents only my views and not of the administration or of my company. But that is, I think there is a window for multilateral action in a second Trump term. And that may be very controversial and maybe out of character. But I'll tell you, a lot of the people in the Trump administration who were initially very upset, including Lighthizer and others, about multilateral, they really have heard from the business community about how important they are. And the tell I'm going to make is that I think WTO reform and the battle for replacing the new head of the WTO is going to be a really important proof point about whether we can return to multilateralism, making trade agreements. And my prediction is, I don't think that the Trump second term is an automatic no on multinational if there's a real opportunity for an agreement. So that's my controversial comment.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. I'm going to move us on to our second question, which, as you can imagine, is how would a Biden administration approach trade policy, and what would Biden administration's priorities be, and what does that mean for business? Karen, I'm going to ask you to start for us this time.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you so much, Pam. Well, I don't think there's going to be a focus in a Biden administration on trade deficits, although I do think there'll be a focus on promoting exports. I think the promotion of exports will be done with, sort of statecraft tools, if you will, advocating on behalf of U.S. Companies. But there's not going to be a strategy of trying to open markets for exports through punitive measures like tariffs and sanctions. So I think that's going to be a bit of a switch. Updating the WTO rules, I think, is going to be a priority. And in part, there's a crossover between rebuilding the economy with the jobs-led growth, and I know that Vice President Biden's sort of positive cross currents between trade and job growth is really looking at procurement and leveraging the $600 billion in purchasing power the U.S. government has. A large percentage of that is in defense industries, but also Department of Energy is sort of the highest purchaser among the civilian agencies. And to do that, there needs to be an updating, to do that successfully, I should say, there needs to be an updating of the WTO rules. I think the Biden administration will look really to enforcing the trade agreements. And as Patrick mentioned, the USMCA and its labor and environmental rules that have been modernized, they look a lot like the steps that were taken in other bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. And in fact, they look a lot like those that were negotiated in the Obama administration under TPP. And so enforcement of those labor standards and environmental protections are going to be high on the agenda. And I think one of the things that, if we do have a Biden administration, is going to be, an explanation that not everything relates to trade, and not everything can be fixed by trade, and not everything is ruined by trade. It's 25 to 28% of the U.S. economy that is trade reliant. but growing jobs through infrastructure and green jobs is going to be another high on the agenda. But I think, sort of toning down, you're going to see a toning down of the rhetoric on trade. You're going to see less punitive measures, for sure, more enforcement measures, and generally a more consistent sort of strategy and a reliance on our partners, long-term allies, and less of an aggressive stance towards our allies.
Thank you very much, Karen. Next, let's go ahead and move to Mark. Mark, can you provide us your opinion on a Biden administration?
Yeah, and I have a lot to agree with on Karen on that, on her last points. Not everything being focused on trade. And as I was preparing for this discussion and doing some research on both administration or both candidates' positions, Vice President Biden had come out recently on his opinion on new trade agreements, and that there will not be any new trade agreements until, quote, we've made major investments here at home in our workers and in our communities, end quote. So as you're looking at just that statement, the focus of this campaign really truly being here at home. And when we apply it to today's discussion on what that means for trade, I think a lot of it will be, as Karen said, really, we're going to enforce what we've got. We're going to continue moving things forward. But there is a focus from the Biden administration on what needs to be done here, right here at home before he's then able to step out as it relates to trade. I also think, and Mark's view on the universe, a Biden administration would be spent a lot of time with rebuilding the United States reputation and rapport with other countries around the world. That's not to say that it is bad across the board, but from their viewpoint, there is work that can be done. And so really looking at that as an opportunity and spending a lot of time with those foreign leaders, some of which he, and likely many of which, Vice President Biden had relationships with under the Obama administration, and really building that up accordingly. There's a lot of effort that I think they would focus there as they are working on rebuilding at home. A couple of the other things, though, that they would also be looking at from an immigration perspective on things that are here at home that will help us moving forward. On the immigration side, the Vice President has put out a plan on legalization for immigration status and things of that nature. That becomes incredibly important when we're looking at agriculture workers, temporary workers coming into the United States during harvest seasons and things of that nature, particularly in the Western United States. That will help allowing us grow, harvest our crops, being able to then turn around and export that through the USMCA and other areas. But those types of programs, expanding on those, building upon those, will have a positive benefit here. While that's more on the regulatory side, and on the upstream supply chain side, definitely will have a downstream from a trade perspective on getting those products out to market, not only in a domestic consumer viewpoint, but on an international side. But I think he's, the Vice President, if elected, will have his hands full and need to be spending a lot of time here at home. So I think trade and foreign relations likely being a secondary priority under a Biden administration.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I know we are running a little bit behind. I don't want to cut Tyler and Patrick short, but just keep in mind our timing here. Tyler, why don't you take the next shot at this one?
Sure, and I'll be brief. Okay, so if a Trump administration is more of the same, I think a Biden administration is more of the same too, but just a different same. Go back to an Obama administration, sort of a mainstream Democratic Party position on trade, I think is probably what we're most likely to see from a Biden administration. I've heard a lot of talk about, oh, well, the TPP was a big missed opportunity. Would a Biden administration try to re-engage the United States there? I don't think so. I mean, we got what we wanted, or a slimmed down version of what we wanted with the TPP and the USMCA. I mean, that was just basically taking the provisions of the TPP and sort of applying it only to Mexico and Canada. And, so we got a skinny version of the TPP with USMC. I don't see a whole lot of effort going across the Pacific again, except that the relationship to China, which we can get into more next, will, I think, be more multilateral in nature and less of a bilateral us against them. The one area that I think the Biden administration could do a lot of good for global trade is as it relates to the European Union, and particularly in GDPR. It is not a trade agreement, but that is one of the biggest issues in the flow of data, the flow of goods, the flow of information across borders. That regulation, because the United States isn't in the European Union and isn't deemed to be an adequate protector of privacy rights, it has real implications for US businesses. It's also, true that the reason we're not seen as adequately protecting privacy rights is because of our national security community. And as a former national security guy, I take some responsibility for that, right? Like we acknowledge that the US surveillance state freaks the Europeans out, and they don't like to be able to have their citizens' data coming to the United States. I think a Biden administration could do a lot of good in that area, especially after the European Court of Justice decision on Schrems 2, which that gets way into the weeds and outside of our scope here, but I do think that's an opportunity for the Biden administration. And if they're listening, which I'm sure they're not, but if they are, that's the area where I would focus.
Tyler, we will make sure your voice gets heard no matter what in the next administration. You've got some great knowledge and insights there. Patrick, would you like to wrap us up on the second question, please, on the Biden administration?
Sure, thanks, Pam. I agree, actually, with much of what has already been said. I think the two watchwords that I would wrap the whole discussion about what a Biden trade administration, trade agenda will look like in a Biden administration is just less, right? Less focus on trade generally as a panacea, which I think Karen makes a really good point. But I also think style-wise, the focus first on focusing on the coronavirus and then, other domestic priorities. Any president coming in has to take care of the people that brought him to office, and that's going to be labor unions and environmental activists and progressives who will have a lot of claim on the agenda for a first term. And trade is not something that unites all of those people, right? It's an opportunity for all those important stakeholders to fight each other. And so I think his natural impulse to be more multilateral, but also, as Mark pointed out, the focus keenly on domestic policies means I don't think they're going to try for a while. So maybe I would say, to sum all of that up, the first maybe year or two of a Biden administration would be a pause, right, on the aggressive activity. So that's my first point, pause. The second part would be, we haven't really talked too much about tariffs. Tariffs are a huge issue all across the business community. It's important to every business likely on this call, somewhere in your supply chain. And I would just say that regardless of who is elected tomorrow, I do not think the tariff regimes we have now, which are historically high, I don't think they're going away. And so if there are supply chain people on here or others who are thinking, oh, there's going to be a big switch flipped in January or February on tariffs, I do not think that's true. I think the idea of it'll be much more reluctance in a Biden administration to use tariffs as a tool of trade negotiation, as this president has been willing to do, but I don't think they're going to go away. And I think that is where I'll leave that. And then lastly, I would say that it all really also comes down to what the US is willing to trade on those issues that Tyler mentioned, right? On GDPR and other, think about internet taxation, which is a huge and simmering issue with the EU right now, greatly affects the way American companies trade around the world, how our assets are evaluated, and where investments are made. So if Colorado is competing with Brussels or other places as a potential investment for a company like Tyler's, how the tax policies that the EU chooses, that's going to drive a lot of that discussion about tax in which jurisdictions. And I think that's going to be a big challenge for the Biden administration to use the general good feelings maybe that they'll generate, right, as a new president, But those are really thorny issues that are not going to go away and are really the centerpiece of these two huge economies about the equities that they have in any kind of negotiation. So that's my short list.
Okay, Patrick, thank you very much. It's great. We're going to move on to a question on China before we get to the Q&A. So both candidates obviously would want to address the challenging relationship with China. This includes such concerns as Chinese dumping of goods, forced technology transfer, inadequate protection of intellectual property, counterfeiting and piracy, the need for further meaningful judicial reform, and effective enforcement of judgments. So what could we expect from President Trump in a continuation of his work with China? And what might we see from a Biden administration? And if you'd like, what would you recommend? Let's see, Patrick, I'm just going to swing it back to you real quick. You're on mute.
Yeah. So I think on China, I mean, if there's no other takeaway from this, is that during the president's entire first term, no issue has consumed more attention from every senior leader in the Trump administration than our relationship with China. And I think until about 10 months ago, there was an intense battle among the intellectuals in the Republican side and the Democratic side, going back for more than 25 years, really, between these two powerful camps. One favoring more China engagement, and the other intensely skeptical about China. Even in the president's leadership, there has been evidence of these two camps, right? The more interventionist, maybe hopeful camp about changing China, about the incredible amount of market opportunity there was in China, and what we hope to accomplish. And I think it would be remiss if we didn't begin a conversation about the US-China bilateral relationship by saying that I have been doing China since I was at the University of Denver now almost 30 years ago. The relationship and this debate between these two sort of camps of intellectuals has raged. And remarkably, in the last 10 months, that battle has ended in a rout. The more hopeful sort of change China through engagement strategy that had been dominant, I think, the Chamber of Commerce view, if you will, of which I would have considered myself a chief proponent, that camp is in DC, in every part of academia, is now a complete loss. That's a complete rout. And the China skeptics are ascendant. And not just ascendant, they are validated because of three things. One, the general Chinese reluctance to agree to any meaningful change in a bilateral agreement. They had a huge opportunity with the Trump administration for a real Nixonian kind of reevaluation of the US-China moment. It didn't happen. The second thing is coronavirus, the incredibly ham-handed way that China managed its relationships with its key trading partners. And I actually would say its closest allies in Europe and Asia over the coronavirus response really was terrible. It was a PR disaster for China, and they found themselves very, very alone. And then capping those two back-to-back failures was a huge setback with the heavy legal intervention in Hong Kong, changing the free market, really poster child for the engagement team of look at Hong Kong. That could be China's future of a free, independent, largely free market example of what China could be. And that recent change in the Chinese national law to restrict the free exercise of speech in China and the crackdown on dissidents just completely cemented the rout between these two intellectual camps. I haven't talked specifically about how that affects individual businesses and companies doing business in the Rocky Mountain West or anywhere in the US. I'll leave that to my fellow panelists, but that's kind of my sum up of where we are today on whatever we're able to achieve, whichever president we have come January 20th, they will have to deal with that route and how we try to improve opportunities for American business. So that.
Thank you, Patrick. Karen, do you want to weigh in on this one? on
Oh,
China?
sure. Thank you. So I think both President Trump and President, if there is President Biden, will have struggles. President Trump had this phase one agreement and with a promise from China to purchase over 200 billion in goods. The first year was they were supposed to meet a target number of 140 billion plus a little north of that. They haven't reached 95 billion yet. So squaring the circle on that day one, I think there's a promise out there. There's an expectation out there that is on the president's list of things to do. And China is not an easy trading partner. So I think that's going to be a challenge even before phase two of the agreement. We're still in a continuing trade war of the battle of retaliations, which doesn't help anybody. The battle of tariffs doesn't help anybody. Increases prices really hard on consumers. And getting to the question that you asked, Pam, how does this help the underlying issues of reform and protection of intellectual property and so on? I mean, so far we haven't seen any real improvement. And I think, as others have mentioned, we're in a global economy, and a go-it-alone strategy on these immovable challenges with China, because everybody, I was engaged in the Clinton administration when China PNTR was negotiated, and there were promises made, some kept, some failed. And why? Because China was an immovable object on a number of these issues. So I think for a Biden administration, as Patrick said, the tariffs that are there, they now have constituencies, full-blown constituencies, right? So it's really hard to pull those back. It's not going to be this light switch. But the other bad news, good news for Vice President Biden, if he is elected, the good news is, I think the way that these underlying challenges get addressed is through a global approach. I mean, there aren't a lot of countries out there that think China is a good actor. So there's a lot of agreement that China needs to play by the same rules that all the other players in the global economy are adhering to. And so it's going to take, more than a village to get that to happen. And I think that is the tack that a President Biden would take. But the bad news on that is that's going to take a lot of time. So in the meantime, you have a status quo that can't be changed and is pretty painful for consumers. So I think it's just potentially a struggle no matter who the president is.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Tyler, do you want to weigh on this one quickly?
Got it. Okay, so I'm going to please my 8-year-old daughter with this statement. I'm going to quote Taylor Swift and say, haters going to hate, and China's just going to be China, right? Like, they're going to do what they're going to do, no matter whether the school of thought that wants to confront China in the US or the school of thought that wants to co-opt China in the US is ascendant. I don't really care. They're going to have a marginal impact on what China does anyway. I mean, that is the DC bias, is that we can actually move things and change things. And you can, but it's on the margins. It's not fundamental changes. If the US relationship with China is going to change, China is going to have to be the one to change, most likely, right? And so I just don't see that happening. So I think the business community, whether it's in Colorado or anywhere else, actually has much more influence over Chinese policy than whether it's the Trump administration or the Biden administration. I mean, if we're just clear-eyed about what doing business in China means, as far as technology transfer and theft of IP, and they're going to block data, and that they're going to try to, they're nationalist, right? So they're going to try to make everything Chinese centric. Just know that going in, and if it's worth it to you to make a short-term profit in order to sell your soul, then do it, and that's fine. But at least be clear-eyed about it. And when US dollars start drying up, China will probably change their minds, or when the actual real world incentives change, that's when China will change. And whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration or the doves or the hawks, it doesn't, to my mind, probably doesn't matter. We've tried everything with these guys over the last 40, 50 years. They're just gonna be China. And it's time for us to accept that.
Okay, Tyler, thank you for that optional viewpoint on China. Appreciate that. Mark, based on our chat conversation, I'm going to move into Q&A if you don't mind.
That's perfect. I agree with everything Tyler just said. He said it perfect.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Okay, I know Karen has to leave us a few minutes early, so we are going to start off with the first question is going to go to Karen. We'll start with her anyway. So as we work our way out of the pandemic, growth will be a bigger issue than ever. What will it take to reduce the trade deficit significantly and thereby increase domestic growth? Can any strategy work if it doesn't include some form of border adjustable consumption tax?
Wow, great question.
That was a mouthful. I hardly got it out.
Yes. So one thing we could do to reduce the trade deficit is increase our savings rate. And one thing that the pandemic has done is actually increased our savings rate. Trade deficits are, they're not caused by monolithic activity. Trade deficits are fed or caused by a multitude of things. I do think that we really need to focus post-pandemic, and hopefully that will be soon, on looking at the economy and building it back, better. Looking at our future industries, helping our industries be better prepared to take on challenges like pandemics in the future. I don't think artificial mechanisms or interventions that cause prices to rise are going to help with growth. I think it's about investment, infrastructure, and helping to seed the ingenuity that we have in the United States. We're the best at doing what we do across. We're sector agnostic across the economy, and there just needs to be the education tools and the financial tools to help get us there.
Thank you, Karen. That's very insightful. I like that. Let's see. Mark, would you like to respond to that question?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's, like Karen said, and it's not my wheelhouse. You're going to have deficits. We're going to be having, I think, trade deficits for a while. I don't know if a border adjusted consumption tax will be able to fix all of that, or even a lion's share thereof it. So lots of ways to look at it. Until we come out of a COVID pandemic environment and are really able to open things up, travel, things of that nature, we're going to have a lot of the different band-aids across the board. My personal viewpoint on it. So could it help? Absolutely. Is it going to be an MLB all? Not sure that we're going to see that anytime soon.
Really quickly, Tyler, before you jump in, Karen, thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate you, and good luck on your live TV interview that you're entering into next.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pam. Good
Yeah,
luck.
thank you, Karen. Okay, yes, we are going to let Tyler respond to that question, and then Catherine, I will let you take over the Q&A from there.
Just very quickly, I mean, I think the word trade deficit has become a dirty word. And let's just be clear, I run a pretty substantial trade deficit with my grocery store here locally, and that's not a bad thing, right? Like it's okay. Sometimes it's what you actually want in order for an economy to grow. So typically when our trade deficit has dipped below a certain level, it means our economy is contracting. And so we don't want that. So let's just, as we're moving into this new political season, let's maybe try to keep that in mind, that those things that were dirty words in the past, like trade deficit, aren't necessarily a bad thing. We just have to think about this holistically. And frankly, we got a lot on our plate before we ever get to a trade deficit. So let's just worry about growing the economy first would be, maybe the advice I would give.
Okay, Catherine, do you want to take the Q&A from here, please?
Absolutely. Okay, our next question from
Catherine, I'm sorry to interrupt, but as a longtime tax lobbyist, right? Somebody just asked like a classic tax question, and so I have to weigh in and say that absolutely, we have chosen as a country and historically the worst possible mechanism for taxing economic activity that really is a drag on productivity, trade, and overall economic success. And if I could wave a magic wand politically and get rid of our corporate income tax and replace it with consumption VAT-like taxes, I don't know a single tax expert, and I talked to a lot of them, who wouldn't take that trade, because it would be a way to supercharge our economy and stop punishing companies for success. So anyway, that part wasn't said, but I just felt desperately interested to endorse such a nerdy tax subculture debate. So.
Sure, and our last question from the audience that you'll each have 15 seconds to respond to is, Trump has threatened to withdraw from the World Trade Organization. If he wins a second term, will those threats become reality, or will he work towards a more comprehensive World Trade Organization reform? And any one of our panelists who wants to speak first, I'll look for the glimmer in your eye. Tyler, how about you?
I mean, I got out of the predicting Trump business a long time ago. I have no idea what the guy will do. I'm not going to pretend. I do think it's a real possibility. Let's just put it that way, that a second Trump administration is not necessarily a good thing for the U.S. relationship with the WTO, but I have no clue, honestly.
Patrick, how about yourself?
Well, I would just say in the Trump predicting business, I'd say take him at his word, right? And what his USTR, Bob Lighthizer, has said on the subject, which is the WTO is not a success, and it hasn't been for a long time, 25 years without a successful new round. It's clearly got a lot of challenges, but I take it as a business lobbyist, or I take it as an encouraging sign that the president came out and the trade representative came out in favor of the Korean finance minister's candidacy to head the WTO. And in choosing a candidate between two capable but different worldviews, they chose a really a long seasoned expert on trade negotiations. The Korean finance minister, she's just a terrific candidate. And I think in the discussion about that, to the extent that the WTO has come up at all, I think that's been somewhat encouraging that they intend to continue to try to reform the WTO and get some better agreement. I think the problem is that the credibility of the WTO is just so suffered in this. First, it was a huge rift between the developing world, the two-thirds world, and rich countries who didn't want to make concessions to permit those poorer countries to export, get more market access, things that we had already given, by the way. We're at like incredibly open. I would say we have a 98% open market for global products, and Europe is at about 70%. So there's a big delta, and those are the two biggest players for trade. And so we're just at a different place than a lot of other countries in wanting to get the WTO there. And I think China's kind of bad actor reputation has also given the WTO a kind of whiff of lack of success.
Thanks,
So
Patrick.
I'm hopeful.
I have to interrupt you because we are at the 1 o'clock hour and I know all of our audience has appointments to get to. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. What an amazing discussion. Thank you so much, Pam, for moderating with us today. Take a look at the links for our upcoming events and check back in with us here at the World Trade Center Denver. Stay well.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.